been a web developer for some time and really always found my passion with the front end and kind of found JavaScript and really ended up enjoying building for the web, especially after a small stint doing mobile apps. Just the freedom and the ability to easily get your site online with Git push was very exciting for me. So I spent most of my career as a software engineer, just building normal products like a product engineer. And then I've been at Vercel for the last 4 years. And when I joined, it was
I have Lee Robertson, who is going to be talking with us about Next.js 15, which is a very Next.js is a very popular tool in the web dev space. So it's going to be an exciting conversation, and of course, we're going to see some code because I want to see what's new. So before all that, let's have a conversation with Lee. How you doing, Lee? Hello there, friend. So it has come to my attention that about 95% of the people who watch the videos on this channel don't subscribe. My goal is to get that number down to 50%. So if you're watching this video and you've liked it so far, please do consider hitting that subscribe button. I would really appreciate if you do. Now let's get back into the video.
I'm doing great. Thanks for inviting me and having me on here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks. Thanks to you for coming. I think we should start off with introductions. So let's I know you. I personally call you Mr. Next.js because you expand Next.js a lot, but can we know who Lee Robinson is? Like who you are, what you've been doing, and as far back as you want to go is nice.
Yeah, so I have been a web developer for some time and really always found my passion with the front end and kind of found JavaScript and really ended up enjoying building for the web, especially after a small stint doing mobile apps. Just the freedom and the ability to easily get your site online with Git push was very exciting for me. So I spent most of my career as a software engineer, just building normal products like a product engineer. And then I've been at Vercel for the last 4 years. And when I joined, it was partially because I was helping use Next.js and helping move my last company over to Next.js for their application. But also I started to teach people in the Next.js community about the framework and how to use it and the things that I liked about JavaScript and React, and started to do that full time at Vercel and have really mostly stayed doing that for 4 years. I've done some other stuff at Vercel as well, but that's kind of been the main thing, as just helping grow the Next.js community.
Yeah, definitely, because I think what you put out there in terms of Next.js code videos is one of like very thorough. I always like to watch them. And yeah, I can't remember the time where I didn't associate you with Next.js of Vercel, but it's actually good to know that you've been there for like 4 years, and it just feels like you've been there from the beginning. Like, so what was it for you that made Next, stick? Because you really like Next.js amongst a lot of people that love it, right? So you mentioned it was a tool at your past company. Was it on the job you started learning Next.js, or you've had like a love for it before there?
Yeah, I think even going back a bit further, when I first was learning web development, the state of web development was not nearly as easy or as approachable for beginners as it is today. And I remember just being really frustrated by the amount of tooling and configuration and things that I needed to learn just to get a site online, when it could be as simple as an index.html. In reality, of course, you're building bigger applications than just that, but it felt really complicated. And once I started using React for my kind of first real job outside of college or university, that was when I like really started to enjoy programming the web a lot more. Like the React mental model just clicked for me. But
Mm,
at that job and then at my next job, there was still just a ton of tooling needed to make a React application work well. So it was about 2017, I think, going into 2018, we started evaluating what options we had in terms of moving our custom Webpack Babel application that was using React on the front end over to something else. And at the time, we had noticed there was this tool called Next.js. It was still pretty new. It was very, very early, but it seemed promising because we didn't really want to do that stuff. we kind of wanted to outsource it to a framework, let the framework get better, and we could just upgrade and not have to spend a bunch of time doing that. So me and others on the team helped move our custom React application over to Next.js over the course of 6 months to a year, we'll call it. Started building new features in parallel as we incrementally moved over, and it's been Next.js ever since. So ever since that point, have been a fan of frameworks in general, just to help you move faster and help a team adhere to kind of similar practices. And that's kind of how I got on Next.
That is actually a beautiful story. And it felt like when you started using JavaScript, React, and Next, you sort of like got to the sweet spot for web development, because I still can remember the time where web dev wasn't this simple, the time with the FileZilla and CSS sprites and all those, feels like a long time ago, but it's not that long really. But I think things have gotten really simpler, and it's thanks to things like the frameworks, the toolings that have really make stuff really good. So to someone who has never touched Next.js, because let's assume someone don't know what Next.js is, how will you describe Next.js to them?
Yeah, so probably the most popular way of building web applications today is React. And I think the reason it's became that popular is because of the React programming model, which is building in components. It's like stacking your Lego blocks. And that the way you write code, the way you read code, the way your team shares code, the way the components compose, that just seems to stick for a lot of people, and they can understand it, and it's maintainable. The second order effect of that is that there's a lot of jobs then that are hiring for React or using React, so it kind of builds on top from there. So if you're building with components and the React component model kind of makes sense for you, there are of course other options in the ecosystem. But if you're using React, what Next.js is trying to do is essentially bake in some of the things that you are probably going to build yourself, such that you don't have to do that. You are probably going to have to figure out a way to move between different routes in your application. You're probably going to have to figure out a way to optimize your images and keep them smaller so that you can help keep your page loads fast, even if you have tons of heavy images. Probably going to have a custom font. Most websites have a custom font, and there's some tricks to get it to load properly that, yes, you can definitely do it yourself if you have the knowledge of doing that, or you can use a built-in component. Same thing with loading third-party scripts, which is actually the most common way that sites get slowed down. Is there's a simple request from the marketing team to add in the Google Tag Manager, the Google Analytics script, and all of a sudden your perfect Lighthouse score goes down. So a lot of that stuff, which I'd argue a lot of it is designed for teams and larger companies who are building with Next.js, but you can also benefit it as a hobbyist just trying to build and use React and not really worry about setting up the infrastructure around writing React components. You just want to write the React components. And as of, let's call it 2 years ago, Next.js has also started to integrate some of the newer React features like server components, server actions, and more, to now where it's at a point where you can, and many companies are now using these in production and kind of using this almost like third generation of React. If like the first generation was class components, the second generation was hooks. Maybe this is the third generation with server components and more server features, something like that.
Yeah, I think it has to be, because my first experience with React, I really hated it. Probably because of class components. Back in the day with this.bind and everything you have to do, it was. I don't think I'm a big fan of classes in JavaScript to begin with, but then with React hooks, functional base is sort of like I like functions, and so I feel maybe 3 weeks or like a month ago, maybe I wrote an article on like my perfect React dosage, because I've been like a Vue user since 2018, and I've been the one to be like, Vue is simpler than React. But when I get to look at it again, from like after writing React Vue's felt for a while with the stuff that I do, I really like React components. I'm not even gonna lie. Like, back on X, I used to be like, okay, why do you all have class name though? It's a common, just dissing React. But I feel like if you get to, it's just like Tailwind, right? Like it took me a while to like get Tailwind, but now it's like love story. I can't start without Tailwind. So now looking at JXS and the model of like Lego blocks, like you said, it's just beautiful, which is like the hooks and functional components. But React Server Components, though, maybe it's still gonna be like this. You hit it first and then you like it, but there is a couple of mixed feelings. At this point, the general sentiment I get from the ecosystem is like the everyday React user, Next.js user, they still don't know what they know what it is, but in terms of application and usage, the general sentiment is that it's sort of like fall short. So I think it's more probably it's early days. So from what you've been doing, because of course you have front row seats with the people building this stuff and also using it, like what is RSC and the benefit today in Next.js 15? Because you said you guys implemented React 19 features, which I guess is also RSC. Yeah.
Yeah, before we go into like why RSC, even just to go back to what you were saying there,
Okay.
like building on the different generations, I kind of felt the
Yeah.
same way. Where when
Okay.
hooks were released, it just really made me connect with React even further. Like writing code in that way felt a lot more natural to me. Reading code from others felt a lot more natural. The abstractions we saw in the ecosystem, like the custom hooks, that also just seemed to click a little bit better. And I think that is really what's helped React grow to what it's at today. But now going forward, to your point, in this new world with server components, server actions, just in general, features in React that are designed to work across the client and the server. So, before React has primarily been mostly client focused, even though you could do some stuff like doing server-side pre-rendering for a while, a long time. But it wasn't really the same as core components being designed to work across both the client and server boundaries. I think the biggest misconception of server components when they came out is it sounded like, and maybe this was a bad explanation on my part, but it sounded like, oh, these are these new components that it's a React component, but it only runs on the server. It can fetch from a database. I guess I'm supposed to move all of my components to that because there's some potential performance benefits or other benefits from it. And the reality is that's not actually the case. In an ideal React and Next.js application using all these latest features, it actually looks something a little bit more like this. You want to have server components where you're doing things like fetching data or talking to your database, but you also want to have client components because client components allow you to do interactivity and use the browser for what it's great at, use the client for what it's great at. It's not necessarily one or the other, but how they work together. And a lot of these abstractions have been built in a way where you want to use client components for certain things, like maybe your form and handling the response back from a form with use action state. Or on the server, you want to have a server action where you can basically automatically create an API that you can hit and save information to your database or update your database. So broadly, these server features in React have been designed in a way where if I want to use these abstractions in a framework, it gives the framework authors these APIs to plug into to build a cohesive experience across the client and the server.
Nice. Yeah, I feel like that because that was the explanation of the use client and the thing at the beginning. At the point I thought I even got it, and then I was like, do I really get it? I don't think I do because it felt even now. I think you are going with server functions or something, not actions again, right? Is it?
Yeah, maybe just
Yeah.
on I think with the name of things, there's a tricky balance between you want to come up with a name that is short, succinct, easy to remember, and hopefully will be a good name in 5 or 10 years. But usually that means that it will be a little confusing for people who are using things today. It's rare, I think, that you can land on something that like solves both of those things. And if you do, then that's awesome. For use client and use server, I feel like at the start, the whole ecosystem, myself included, was trying to figure out the best way to explain these things. And it took a couple iterations, probably like a year, honestly, to land on something that kind of makes sense. And I feel like, Dan on the React team probably had the best explanation of how these two directives can work. And I like to riff on how he framed it. So the way I like to think of it now is in a framework like Next.js or a React server framework, all of your components get pre-rendered to HTML during the build. But optionally, if you would like to have some client interactivity and you mark an entry point into the client part of your application, the client graph with use client, you're essentially making a script tag that's also going to be sent to the browser that's going to include some JavaScript that gets included and makes a network request to load that on the client. On the inverse, with use server, you're already in the client graph and you want to call back to the server. And you need to talk to your database, you need to save some information, you need to do some mutation. What use server does is it allows you to make this connection between the client and the server, like you're calling some remote procedure call or RPC. You're just calling some function that's doing some mutation somewhere else. And that's actually back over on the React side on the back end or the server of your application. And so it's like ways of jumping across the boundary or different parts of the graph and can be used kind of interchangeably.
Yeah, I'm truly rooting for like I think even now I think it's a little bit more stable in terms of understanding. People are writing about it, people are talking about it, people are using it, and we're gonna get to a point where okay, it's like hooks, right? Like deal transition to like React hooks, which like influence views are composable because it was just a good way to build stuff, right? It was just good. But in the early days, it's gonna be like, okay, this is new. So I really want this to be the story with RSC because I feel I think you will have been building on React and Next for so long to know not to disrupt for just this change, for just the sake of like, okay, this is something new. There must be a benefit here. Most of us can't see it yet, but I feel we just have to give it time, and we're definitely gonna get to that point where it's good. So speaking about getting to that point where it's good, let's move on to Next.js 15, which is one of the reasons why we're having this, right? Like I think you announced it at NextConf, and there's also like a blog post about it. So let's talk about Next 15. What stand out for you in Next 15 today? Like when it was released from RSC 1 to RSC 2, what was like, because I believe every major release have a theme, even though you have other things you do in it, there should be a theme. So what was the theme for Next 15?
Yeah, I would say major releases definitely have themes. Generally, to give you a little more context on how we do versioning with Next.js, we try to abide by semantic versioning as well as we can. So if there's any breaking change in the framework, whether it's bumping the minimum Node.js version or an API is being deprecated or removed, and so on and so forth, that would be the reason to have a major release. So we try to bundle or put those things together for one major release that then we can have good communication around what needs to change. So there's a lot of improvements, a lot of bug fixes, a lot of that which we can talk about. But the big thing usually with a major release is what are the things that are going to require me to make changes or are going to require some user effort while upgrading. And the goal on our side is to make that as minimal as possible and also give you tools to help smooth out that upgrade path. So we've been doing this for a pretty long time now, on Next.js 15, where we've had folks move between major versions. And I think we've done a decent job so far of giving developers code mods that will automatically update their code when there are breaking changes. But we wanted to take that a little bit further with an upgrade CLI. And the upgrade CLI, to me, it just helps you know what code mods are even available. If you don't go read all of the docs and see there's 6 different code mods, it just gives you the list of the things that you can run when you are trying to go to a specific version. And in this case, it also runs external code mods that another team is maintaining for the React 19 transition. So our hope, and it seems like that's working pretty well so far, is that will help smooth the journey to Next.js 15 that is preparing the React ecosystem for React 19, another breaking change. And there's like a few minor breaking changes in Next.js that all have code mods to go along with them. So that's the big thing, kind of pairing with the React 19 upgrade. The other like major theme I would say is Turbopack. So Turbopack for development, so Next.dev -- turbo or -- Turbopack, that's now stable and ready for adoption. We've been working on it for some time now to speed up the local development environment when you're compiling your code on your local machine, when you're starting up your dev server. And part of the hope with getting Next.js 15 out is that it will be ready for people to move to and see performance improvements while working with the app router locally. I'd say that's probably the biggest theme of Next.js 15.
Nice. That's awesome. So I could see a lot of breaking change. In fact, even in our comments, we have a couple of people like, okay, can you not break Next every time? But in my mind, I'd be like, it is a major version though. So I mean, there's gotta be a couple, but of course not too much because I don't think anybody likes the breaking change, even though with semantic versioning, you're allowed to make breaking change if you're going to major version. So one of the breaking change that really stood out for me because I use inertia, and I don't know if you know about the tech, but it just lets you use React views Svelte with any of the classic MVC like frameworks. And inertia 2.0 is also moving from the ground up to have async requests. And because for a tech that was made originally to mimic server-side style of apps, but still give you SPA, it's kind of interesting. It was going back to like async requests because, of course, that actually deviates. Then with server-side rendering in RSC, which I feel like Next.js and RSC is trying to like get us to do more work on the server. But now we have async request APIs because, of course, it doesn't make sense for every page should be blocking by the server for us to get stuff. So that's kind of interesting. So is that the middle ground for, because there are other stack, like I think 10 stack start is going fully client-side routing, while Next.js is actually same thing with RSC, let's do things on the server. Async request APIs, is that the middle ground for like some pages can be server side and some can actually have async requests?
Yeah, so three things here. One, we can go back to like the semantic versioning, then async request
Yeah.
APIs, and then
Yeah.
which parts are server and client on route transitions.
Yeah.
So I definitely understand people's feelings around major versions and going through breaking changes, even if they're small, even if there's code mods. I think a lot of people just, it's hard to keep up with the JS ecosystem sometimes, and
Yeah.
just updating all the things in your package JSON, it can kind of be a tax. So our hope going forward is we want to try to have less major versions, fewer major versions, which means just getting better about feature flags, which we've had for a while, experimental flags, and releasing more things in minor versions. So just trying to reduce the number of breaking changes. There inevitably will always be some. There's always things you need to do, like bumping the Node.js version for security reasons and new features, but trying to reduce that as much as possible and make a major version kind of nothing burgers. Hopefully that's the direction we can start to go to in the future. So definitely want to make progress there. On the async request APIs, so the kind of end developer benefit of this in Next.js 15, when you run the code mod and your params and search params now become async, you're not really going to see much difference, because right now it's not really having any effect on the outputted application that gets created from Next.js. What it is doing is it's laying the foundation for where we're going to take Next.js next. And I also think it's just a little bit more intuitive. If you were starting the framework from scratch today, you would kind of expect that accessing things from the incoming request, you would need to make a choice whether that was something that should be dynamic and you would await that information, or whether you would want to cache that information and reuse it for a subsequent request. So part of the reason why we've kind of decoupled that is let's get everyone upgraded and moved to this new version that hopefully is a little bit more intuitive, even though there isn't necessarily a in-user benefit to it yet. But it lays the foundation for where we want to take the programming model of Next and the caching model of Next in future versions, which we talked a little bit about in Next.js Conf. I can talk a little bit about here as well later if you'd like.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that on async request APIs. On the on routing, whether routing happens on the client or the server, yeah, you make a good point that right now the Next.js app router is a server-centric router. So all of your route transitions are going to the server, and there's kind of two gotchas here that are definitely things that we've seen folks kind of stumble with that we want to continue to make better. The first one is you click on a link and you're kind of waiting for something to happen because the route that you're going to, it's going to the server, and the component you're going to was fetching data. So you click on a link and you wait a couple seconds, but you're not seeing anything in the browser, and you're wondering kind of what's happening. And it's because you're waiting for that data fetching. So one of the gotchas here is continuing to educate on the underlying foundations of the app router and why that is. So the first one is that the app router is built on React suspense and React transitions. So when you're navigating between routes, that is a transition. And if you want to listen to that transition, there are hooks inside of React that allow you to do that and then show some kind of visual indication that the transition is pending. We actually published a little package for this. I think it's called React Transition Progress. It's not necessarily a Next.js thing. It's just a React ecosystem thing that can show like a loading bar at the top or a loading spinner or something if you want. That's one option. The other option is that Next.js has a convention called loading.tsx, which uses suspense. And what you can do is when you transition to another route that has some data fetching, you can show the loading state or the fallback state for suspense first while you're waiting for the data to be fetched. And I think intuitively that makes sense. There's a couple gotchas in there where sometimes the loading wouldn't show up because some heuristics inside of Next that we're hopefully making better with partial pre-rendering, to where you can kind of either guarantee that you're going to have a fast state to navigate to immediately, or the build will error when you're trying to build your application because you haven't got the pre-render to the state that you're wanting. The third thing here is there are some other React hooks that might be a better fit for the type of operation that you're doing. So for example, one of them is use optimistic. So if you're updating the URL, but you're not necessarily navigating to a new route, you might want to use optimistic to immediately show those updates on the page and then kind of update the URL as a side effect of that. Because updating the URL, it's not necessarily blocking any of the interaction that you have on the page. You want the UI to remain fluid as you click add to cart, for example. So for example, the Next.js commerce template demo.forsell.store or forsell/commerce is the repo on GitHub. That's an example of using use optimistic when you click on add to cart. And there's some other goodies in that repo if you want to see like some of the Next.js 15 patterns. So that's kind of the client server routing stuff.
That's really well thought of. I think I like it. While you were mentioning about the progress, I have this pet peeve with some Next.js and React apps where during development everything moves fast. Of course, you click, and then when you visit the live website, and I click on something, nothing happens, and then maybe like 3 seconds, it goes to the next page, and in my mind, I feel this is a degradation from the experience of you just letting the browser just load, because at least I know something is loading, because it always feels as if I broke something. And I think that is jarring. Even me as a technical person is jarring. Then just think about a non-technical person, it will just keep clicking on the link for it to navigate. So I feel, I don't know if you would agree, progress should be like a, I don't know, like a default, right? Because some things will take time, and depending on how you write your application, some things might even take longer because maybe you're making a lot of fetches that you're not supposed to make. It's not optimized, but now there's no feedback to the user that something is happening, and then we are thinking something is broken. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I definitely hear you. It is one of the benefits of a traditional multi-page application or an older kind of
Mm-hmm.
server-only application that kind of sprinkles in JavaScript as needed is that page transitions just are normal, web transitions. You use the
Yeah.
browser loading spinner, you see it while you're waiting for the next page to load, and that's nice in some ways because a lot of end users know that behavior. They understand what it means for there to be a browser loading spinner. Um, what the Next.js app router and what React transitions are doing here is allowing you to make changes but not block the UI while you're making those changes kind of off screen, essentially. And in doing that, it's effectively replicating a lot of that loading system, that
Mm-hmm.
scheduling system. So there is a way to show that visual indication while that work is happening. It just requires developer effort versus the browser being the one that's actually managing the loading state. So it's tricky. It's a powerful tool that hopefully we can make easier to use, better education, better examples, because it can create some really powerful experiences. But I agree that there is some simplicity in the model of just you go to a page and the browser spins, and that can be nice too.
Yeah, and even if so, like my stack using, so I still build single page applications. Like it's of course if most things are not really client side, but it mimics that. But there is like a, especially for navigation, I feel if it's gonna look app like, of course, if there's no spinner, there's no progress bar, but some pages just take a while to load, and it always feels as if it's broken. So, and now you saying that it's just confirming what I thought. It's gonna take developer effort, and that's now if I'm building like that in development, I probably would just assume, right, like that. Okay, this is how it's always going to navigate. If I click, it just go. But I won't actually concern myself with latency. Then when this start happening, I would have to now learn how to do it. So my take is like probably the framework we should just put a progress bar, then you turn it off if you don't need it. Right? Because I feel like by default,
Yeah.
any sort of progress is sort of good.
Yeah, you bring up two good points there. The first one is client side transitions and wanting that, and the second one is like developer tools. So the first one, yeah, I agree. There's more we can do to provide kind of out of the box tools to make this easier versus having to install a third party package. One thing, like generally to help you understand how we're thinking about this broadly, is single page apps have a ton of amazing things for them. Multi page apps have a ton of amazing things for them and features for them. We kind of want the best of both worlds because in that single page app world where you do have those really fast client transitions, generally the trade-off is then you're having to go from client back to server to go fetch your data from the database versus having a server component that could be close to a database, fetch the data and return that UI in the same network round trip. So while you might have that faster transition there, you may be paying for that in other places in your application. Not always, there are some solutions that can kind of mask that. But one of the things that Next.js does in this realm is we just, with Next.js 15, added a new form component. This form component,
Mm.
when let's say you're wanting to search, for example, you can use the form component on an input. The user hits enter in the browser, and even if your internet's really slow, it will client navigate. It will pre-fetch that page you're going to, like /search.
Mm.
It will client side navigate to that new route, and the server will still kick off the data fetching for your search page that's going and fetching results from your database. So it's trying to build in some of those things, like you mentioned, into the framework itself, into components
Yeah.
to make that
Yes,
experience a
please.
little bit easier. I still think there's more we need to do there, both on the
Mm-hmm.
built-in bits, but then to your second point, just around the general developer tools that we provide to help you understand that you're even in that state. because to your point, there's intentional differences between your local environment and your production environment, and we think a lot of those trade-offs are good and we want to keep them that way. But it can be confusing when something works one way locally and it works differently after you run a production build and start on the production server. So finding ways to like ruin that surprise and make it happen on your local machine so you can understand the behavior or like simulate the behavior without having to wait for the full build, I think will be really nice. I mean, there's kind of two ways you go about that. One is you simulate what it will look like in production, or two, you make the builds so fast that, well, yeah, I'll just run a production build and then start it up. So we're kind of trying to do both of those. Turbopack for builds will be the next thing we're working on. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Please, I would definitely love to see work on that because it's just one of my pet peeve. Like, oh, please, just put a spinner somewhere. So I was gonna get to form because it's kind of interesting. I like forms because I feel all of most of the things we do on an app is a form submission. So just like you say, you have a new form component. And I see a couple of things that I like, especially the prefetching you mentioned and the client-side navigation, and then the progressive enhancement, which is the form it's not completely JavaScript. It can still, just in case JavaScript hasn't loaded yet and you're doing like a search, it can still do like a full page reload, which is, I really love that because we could have hefty JavaScript and for forms, we could just let it be progressive. I like this. So how long has this been in the work? Like, was this a very requested feature? Because I know there are a lot of form options for React. And so next form, it's mostly attuned to React 19, right? Our way of doing things, unlike the other forms out there.
Yeah, it's been we've been working on this for a little bit. It is released in Next.js 15. It works for both the app and pages router. And it will work with React 19 applications as well. Generally, the way to think about it is it's solving some of the hard parts that really the framework is usually the place that work should happen. We have an example in the blog post of the code you could write if you were doing this as your own kind of user abstraction. And like most people just don't really want to mess with that. That doesn't necessarily replace, you talked about form libraries. There's still a lot of form libraries in the ecosystem generally doing, I would say, like two categories of things around type safety and then things around form validation. And this doesn't really change or replace any of those. It more augments those. Kind of similar story with server actions. So you mentioned progressive enhancement. Similar story there, where if you're building forms, not using the form component, but you're just building, normal HTML forms where you're calling a server action and you're using use action state, which is one of the new hooks in React 19, that can also be progressively enhanced. So when you run a build, that HTML gets pre-rendered, even though you have a client component. And if a user loads your app and that script tag that gets created because you had use client, if that script hasn't yet loaded, your application doesn't lose those clicks when they're trying to submit your form or they're trying to use your form. React can effectively like replay that to make sure that those actions are still captured and progressively enhanced. So it's not necessarily that it's designed to work without JavaScript. It's designed to enhance once the JavaScript loads. And that same model with server actions and use action state also kind of works with the ecosystem. So we're already seeing some abstractions kind of built on top of this to do things like type safety and integrate with typed schemas like Zod, just to make the DX a little easier.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for making that a little bit clear. So I think we should take two visual questions and then we could talk about, no, not talk anymore. No, show me what new in next 15. I want to see it. So first of all, is it myth or true, or how true? Because I do see once in a while people be like, okay, Next.js have vendor lock-in with some versus specific features. Like even in the comments here, I'm looking at one right now. All right. So, and they want to know, what are the version specific features, if it's true, if they exist at all, and you know, the caching stuff, when do they use server component? I think we've actually talked about that a little bit. So we should start with like, is it yes or no? Are there vessel specific features, and how does that play in the entire next deployment and development thing?
Yeah, so I would recommend, if for folks who are curious about this a bit more, definitely check out the recent Next.js Conf. So it was just last month
Mhm.
keynote
Yeah.
on the Vercel YouTube channel. If you want to skip directly towards the end, there's my part where I talk a little bit about this. But I cover kind of a few main categories. The first one is we have made some changes in Next.js 15 to make the self-hosting story a bit easier. There was a few gotchas around like caching headers and image optimization, where we just wanted to make that experience easier for those folks based on their feedback. The second one was improving documentation and examples. So all of the features work while self-hosting. They just, some of them require different configuration. So caching, for example, the default is that the cache will be in memory. But if you're deploying Next.js to a
Mm.
Kubernetes setup, for example, where you have multiple different versions of your Next.js application, you need to have a cache that is separate from those many Next.js applications, whether that's Redis or some kind of durable storage somewhere. And we have a hook
Mhm.
for doing that. It just wasn't as obvious, I think, on how to do that. So we have a number of different examples for deploying to different providers now that are linked to the documentation. And then finally, I also made I think it's like
Yeah.
40-minute video around
Yeah.
self-hosting that basically covers how you can configure every single feature of Next to work while you're deploying, and deployed it to a $4 VPS, which is fun. So
Mm.
if you're
Yeah.
curious more on self-hosting Next, definitely check out my video there as well.
Yeah. So the self-hosting story, definitely, I love the video. You did actually watch it, and how you illustrated it was like just a masterpiece. And I like the idea of, okay, I could do stuff for cheaper, self-hosting it in VPS, but I feel like I'm a little bit in between, because we know you're not just deploying your app, right? You're deploying databases, you're deploying maybe your store, even like image storage and file storage and all that. So in the self-hosting story, we're just talking about self-hosting Next, right? We're not talking about like any other part of the full stack app circle. You still have to do stuff for your databases and Redis and the rest. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can definitely self-host your database as well. I think I would love, and maybe there already exists one. I talk about it a little bit in my video, but not as much. But a video that goes into some of the intricacies and trade-offs of self-hosting your own
Mm.
database. There's kind of multiple levels of expertise here. Like, if you're very good at this stuff and you want to really be an infrastructure person, you can manage your entire database yourself, which can be a very cost-effective option. Generally, it can get tricky when you get into things like backups and upgrades. And most cloud providers have some kind of managed database version. So you're still not necessarily using a SaaS product, like a SaaS database solution. You could still use a cloud or VPS like solution. It's just a separate server box that's a
Mm-hmm.
managed instance that has backups and upgrades. That's like kind of a
Mm.
middle step. But then again, for a lot of people, the free tier on certain database companies like a Supabase, Postgres, or others might be satisfactory. There's also been a resurgence of SQLite, which is pretty
Yeah.
cost effective and can be configured to work pretty well in self-hosted setups. Terso is
Mm.
one cloud company that's hosting SQLite. So yeah, I think for folks who really want to cost minimize, it's fun to just check out self-hosting. And the
Mm.
trade-off you might, or the conclusion you might come to is like, this is cool, but I don't want to do it. Like, I want to just write
Yeah.
application code. And like, that's fine too. Some people are willing to pay the, 5, 10, 15, $20 a month to just not worry about it and just write product code.
Yeah. I think so too, because like most things at the surface, it sounds really good. Oh, I pay like a fraction of what I used to pay. But in practicality, when I think about it, and when I see other people who self-host, you probably see them with a server guy. And right now, I have a couple of applications. I'm the server guy, but I don't do server stuff because I use like a pass to do that. And when I think, okay, I would probably have to be fairly good with Docker. I never did like Docker. And then I have to worry about self-hosting my databases. Right now, databases are like very easy for me to do. Why would I want to take on that complexity just to, is the savings really worth it? It's just what I think when I think about it. Because the promise of self-hosting is sweet, but in practicality, you would gains and trade-offs, you would definitely need to have someone who understands the systems for you to actually have something that would, because right now we have stuff like have like zero downtime, you know, um migrations are easy, backups are easy. I don't even worry about backup because the Postgres thing just does its thing. So I feel this, it's not as black and white as people think it is when they think like just self-host. It's not.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, if the first goal is to cost minimize because they're just trying to get started, they're just starting like a, like an indie hacker journey or something, a lot of them can then graduate to a point where maybe now that they have made some recurring revenue, they don't have as much time to spend on the infrastructure stuff. And now they're using managed services. It kind of just depends. I've seen people do it a lot of different ways, but I encourage people just to have the knowledge and education about it so they can make their own choice for what works best in
Mhm.
their app.
I like it. So one more question from a question pool here. So this one is a little bit, is one I really want to get into. What has been the auth story? Because I know there's next auth and people like it, and there's been some bugs, probably because it's still early. So I could give a pass there. But the question here is like, when is Next going to standardize auth? Because I feel auth should be like I think auth should be like a framework thing, like the basic form. Like give us like maybe session based or JWT, but I think people are always looking for ways to do auth today. While can the framework standardize auth, and why haven't you all done it so far?
So, yeah, it's a tricky one. I think it kind of depends on what people want out of their authentication setup. So, for the most basic session based user password email
Mhm,
authentication, I think that Next.js has some pretty good solutions to make this a lot easier than even a Next.js or React app 3 or 4 years ago, with server components, server actions, middleware, for example. However, a lot of people are looking for abstractions for things like OAuth. So whether it's
mm,
Google or GitHub or others, or they're trying to do more advanced auth techniques like pass keys or one-time passwords. Um, Generally, my recommendation for most people, which is, maybe this is a hot take, but for like side projects and things, like it's probably fine to do email password. I think it removes a lot of the complexity of um, dealing with auth abstractions. And there's something nice about having a very low level set of tools that just do your cryptography or just sign and encrypt in your application versus a full abstraction. Not everybody wants to do that, but I think it's helpful to learn about. If you're building like an application for work, you probably want to lean on abstractions from actual auth companies. um, for example, one company that does this pretty well is Work OS, which
mm,
they are going to give you a bunch of things that simplify single sign-on, like enterprise ready things. If you're building an enterprise app, like you're probably going to need a bunch of those things for RBAC and access controls. But for side projects, smaller projects, you just don't need to worry about that stuff. In terms of next auth or other community auth packages, I feel like it's been hard, I think, for the ecosystem to find the right abstractions for auth. I recently saw the Lucia auth maintainer
Yeah.
came out and wrote a post about how really there wasn't a good abstraction for the database connection between the auth library and all the different adapters, and kind of pivoted the library to be more of a set of recipes or patterns for how you do auth, which I think is
Mm.
interesting, and it kind of matches what the UI library component world has arrived at, which is yes, I can use one kind of abstracted bundled UI component library that does everything all in one, or I can use something that allows me to just like copy and paste the bits that I need. It has the patterns that I want, put them in my application, and own that code myself. And that's kind of what Shadcyan UI does. So I'm kind of leaning on the like copy paste the user auth based patterns into your own app. If you're building something small like that, that might work out great for you. And I actually have a SaaS starter template on my GitHub repo that uses this, and it shows how to do cookie-based user password auth that saves to a Postgres database. So if you're curious, that's something I'd recommend checking out.
Mm. Nice. So from what you said, I think what jumped out for me was like, okay, probably this authing is a symptom, not a problem. And probably the not, I wouldn't say problem, is the options of different ways to talk to a database. Because when you look at our cousins like the Rails and Laravel, they mostly just have like one way and it's built into the framework, which is like their ORMs. So that just simplify doing things like auth because because it's first party, But now we have Prisma, we have all the other ones that are out there, and I think it's an interesting problem because how do you write one opinionated way that just work when you have all these ways to talk to a database? So now I'm actually seeing the real issue there. So off the top of my head, I'm thinking, wouldn't this be a good time for next ORM? But I don't think you guys have any interest in having an ORM because the ones that exist are really good and people like them, like the Prisma and the rest. So what it should be really cool to have next ORM because that just takes the pain out of like wanting to consider every other
Yeah.
ORMs out there, right? What do you think?
Yeah, what you're touching on, I have a good tweet about this I can find and
Yeah.
send over, but
Okay.
what you're touching
Mhm.
on is essentially the difference between the JS ecosystem and the PHP or Ruby ecosystems, the Rails, Laravel ecosystems. Um,
Mhm.
on the on the latter there, they just kind of prefer to build all of the abstractions into the core of the library, and I think Taylor from Laravel has some good points on how that can lead to some really beneficial things that come from a single person or a small group of people who are kind of adhering the same design principles across all of these different sub packages. So if you use the auth solution, it's going to work and integrate well with the roles RBAC solution as well as the
Mhm.
queue system and so on and so forth. I think that can be really powerful for a lot of people. The reality for me is like I just don't know if the React JavaScript ecosystem actually wants that because the few times it's actually been tried, it just seemed like it didn't really work. And maybe we'll end up there at some point. Next.js is kind of doing this. It's just not doing it for everything. So we're doing it for the things that we think that the framework has a unique advantage of simplifying: images, fonts, scripts,
Mm.
forms, and so on. There are other areas where there's a lot more activity in the ecosystem: ORMs, queues, and so on and so forth. And I'm not sure that it's time for us to try to have an opinion there. Maybe. No, I'll never say never, but I think at
Mhm.
least for now, just trying to make sure we integrate and work well with whatever choices those developers want to use is kind of top of mind for me.
Yeah, I think it's true because I think Westboss has a quote about this that I like is that I want an opinionated framework, but the opinion just have to be the one I like at the time. So that's sort
Yeah,
of
that
like
checks
the
out.
thing.
That checks out.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting problem, but I just feel, you know, when I see devs talk about, okay, there's just too many ways to do stuff, and then you tell them, okay, do you want this set of opinions? I'd be like, no, okay, I like this opinion, but not all 100%. I want it 80, and then I want something else, and then that just breaks the whole model of you trying to like
Yeah.
simplify things. But I think you're right, really. JavaScript, I don't really want
To
opinions.
give you an example, one challenge I will give to anyone in the Next.js community who's watching this is check out my shameless plug. Check out my SaaS
No, go
starter
ahead.
starter repo, because I keep hearing things like, well, I have to use this library for this, or I have to use this library for this, or I'm not sure that server actions can do this. And I think I'm pretty happy with where I've landed in this repo, where I have type safety on my queries. I have type safety on my mutations. I
Mm,
have an auth solution that integrates with a Postgres database without using that many libraries.
mm,
And I think it's a happy medium. And Next.js is doing a lot more out of the box than it used to. But there's a tendency, I think, in the ecosystem to, I have a problem, I want to pull for a package. And I think the challenge is like to think critically when you say I want to pull for a package, and see, maybe I can actually build a small abstraction in my application that solves just what I need. I think with AI tools, this is a lot more feasible, because not only can it help you build the abstraction, but it can also help you understand the abstraction, versus adding layers of node modules and layers of dependencies that you'll have to maintain for, the life of your application.
mm. Yeah. Totally, totally. I'm definitely going to plug in the SaaS template because SaaS templates are the rave these days, you know. So I'm going to put that in. So yeah, I think we should get into code. This has been an interesting conversation. There's so much questions coming to my head, but we got to wrap up sometime. So let's get into the code, and then we'll see the things we've spoken about, async API, and the form. I see you have some security improvement, because when Sever Actions came out, people were sort of like pointing out, like, okay, this is a security nightmare waiting to happen. And then when I saw enhanced security for Sever Action, I'm like, okay, you all actually making sure that there are no foot guns, because I feel so. This is my own hot take, right? With Sever Actions, I feel most JavaScript developers are traditionally front-end developers, right? And for my interactions with most of developers that are front-end, they don't really grasp more of the back-end or the full stack concepts. So you sort of need to protect them from foot guns, because they just don't know. And it's not even a problem, because this is not what their expertise is at. They're just like building rich clients. So that was one concern, with like, okay, with several actions bridging this barrier, this chasm, wouldn't it make people that don't really care much of the server do server stuff and do it bad, and then get vulnerable applications out there? So I really like the enhanced security for server actions.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's, if you lower the barrier of entry for beginners to use the server, that does come with potential trade-offs of them understanding what it means to have a server environment that can have access to a database,
Yeah.
which is the same as you're building an API, the same as if you're building kind of a back-end only application, but you're kind of coming at the problem differently, where the front-end focused developer is learning about that stuff versus the
Mm,
inverse. And
yeah.
it's funny because you have that same problem in the other way, where a backend developer learns about the front end and then they're like, oh, I can expose environment variables in this way, or oh, there's other security things I didn't realize could happen
Mm,
when I'm back end focused and I learned the front end. So both sides kind of require upskilling on what it means to build a full stack app. And the more that we can
mm,
do in the framework to simplify that process, and just
yeah.
built in security into what we have, I think the better off we can be.
Totally. I love it. So yeah, let's see some next 15 code. I'm ready.
All
Let's
right.
go.
So
Yeah.
rather than starting from scratch, which we had talked about potentially doing. I actually just went ahead and grabbed the SaaS starter thing, the SaaS starter app that I was talking about, because there might be some more filled out code and more filled out patterns in here that we can talk about. Does that work for you?
I love it. I love SaaS. Go.
So this is, yet another SaaS template, but it does, it's free, it's open source, and it might show some interesting patterns. We have a landing page, we have a pricing page that I need to add some API keys locally, I think. I don't know if I have those set up yet. Maybe not. We'll see. I just cloned this on this machine, so it might not be here. Oh, I need a Stripe key and I don't have it locally. Okay. Well,
Stripe.
we can
Maybe
I'll
you can
get
look
that
at,
later.
is that like a hosted version?
Oh yeah, there's also a hosted version if you want to go check that out.
Just demo that.
Next, SaaS start.
Yeah, let me just demo
there's
that.
a pricing page. You can sign up. So just give it one of those. And you can go in here. You can invite people to your team, test that test. You can change your name. And then if you go back here, okay, there's my new name. You can see all the activity. You can change your password, delete your account. It's got a bunch of stuff. And you can go into Stripe and purchase plans if you want. So all of this is kind of included out of the box. And yeah, there's some interesting things, I think, potentially in the code to take a look at. Maybe first is to talk about the auth setup. Actually, I'll just make this full screen. So the way this middleware works, I'll actually make this even bigger. The way this middleware works is it's running on basically like normal routes. It's not running on APIs or static files or images. On normal routes, we're going to define the protected routes we have in our application. We're going to look at the incoming request. And if it's protected or there isn't a cookie, then we just go sign in. But then this is how we're doing our kind of cookie-based auth, is we check for the token, we check the expiration date, and then we can go and update the cookies just directly in middleware, which is kind of nice. So if you go look at this auth session library, for example, we can look at like sign token, sign token or verify token. So this is using some libraries that take care of the signing and hashing passwords and all that stuff. I'm not doing that from scratch. I wouldn't recommend doing any of that scratch. So Jose and then bcrypt are two popular libraries to do this. So that's how I kind of hash the password. That's how I compare the passwords using that library. That's how I sign tokens. That's how I verify tokens. And then when I mentioned that Next.js has some built-in utilities that make kind of session management a little bit easier, you see with get session, I can just await cookies and read the cookies. And this is one of those async request API changes in Next 15 we talked about. Cookies is now an asynchronous function. So I'm able just to await cookies and get the session value back. And then I'm also kind of verifying the token here. Same idea with set session, where I can call cookies and set that value. So that's pretty nice, I think. We can also look at where we use get session. Maybe we don't use it directly anywhere. Let's see. Let's go to like a page. I want to see if there's an example of a. No, I don't think there's a good example of an async API for params in here anywhere, but we could look at this, for example. So on our settings page, we are fetching the user, which is, let's go take a look what this looks like. This is also reading from the cookies. I guess we could probably combine those two functions. Verifies the token, and then it goes to the database and, excuse me, fetches the user based on the ID, returns that value. And if there's no user, we can redirect. And this is all in the server component. We just mark it async. And this can be kind of the entry point into our application. And then we can, once we know that we're authenticated, and we can go in here and get the team for the user. So we can check and make sure that we're viewing the right information. Again, this is using our kind of data layer. It's using Drizzle. So I've got this kind of gnarly nested Drizzle relation here, which there's multiple ways you can do this. I was kind of Drizzle maxing here, so I don't know if this is the best way of doing this super nested, but it is a way. And then we do this serialization of data on the server to the client. So we talked about the two different kind of graphs. Right now, this is running in the server environment. And I have this settings component, which is a client component. But I want to send it data that I fetched on the server. So when I'm passing this as a prop, it's kind of the equivalent of the older methods in Next.js where you were fetching data on the server, like get server-side props or get static props. We're serializing that JSON in this instance, and we're forwarding it to the settings component, which is this client component that uses some of these new React 19 features. So it includes a script tag, use client, includes a script tag to run this code on the client side, but this component is also pre-rendered. So the settings page is using a form, and it uses use action state, the React 19 feature, to be able to kind of go back to the server, call an endpoint, and then return the value, whether it was a error or success. And in this instance, the form action here is removing a team member. So you'll see down below here, we have this form action where we're managing a subscription. We're going to Stripe. And then down here, we have this form action, remove action, which is reading from use form state. And then we have a button that's type submit to actually submit the form. So this can be progressively enhanced as well. So let's go to remove team member. This is what's being used in use action state, and it is in a file that's marked with the use server directive. So the functions exported from here are going to be basically like API endpoints that we can call. So there's a bunch of things in here, a bunch of different actions, but one thing that could be interesting to talk about is this kind of wrapper function that we have around the actions, which is a common request, I think. So sign up, sign in, and others in here, we have these validated actions, and they take in some schema, which uses Zod, so email, password, and others. And then we get back some information from the kind of wrapper function, and we can use that to check and make sure that it conforms to that schema. So I have this kind of, I call it like a local middleware inside of here, but I have this validated action that is essentially just using Zod to check and make sure that the data that was passed in matches what my schema expected. But if you want to take this a step further, I also have validated action with user. And this is essentially doing like an authorization check. So not only do we do the Zod check to make sure that it matches the schema, we also check and make sure that there's a user and that it's authenticated. And in here, you could check like RBAC, you could check that they have access to be able to modify this resource, for example. But that allows us to do some other interesting stuff. Validated user, or no, validated action. Yeah, like this here, update password. So updating a password, there's a schema, and then you get back the user. So I only want to be able to run this action if the schema matches, and then give me back the user information so that I can use it, for example, here to get the user based on their ID, get the team. So that's just a quick look at this repo. There's a bunch more here to dig into, and curious if you have any questions top of mind.
So the first question that comes to my mind is this file. Because first of all, I can't see the file name yet. But this file, is it would you want to break it up? Because I feel like it's a lot going on though. Don't you think so?
Yeah, that's a good question. My preference here is, I'll just go to my website. There's a blog post here if you want to learn more about it. I have this blog post called My Stack.
Okay.
And I talk through like kind of what I'm using right now, but there's a few things in the way that I write code that I kind of prefer. So this is a controversial one. We don't have to get into that. But generally, I prefer larger files over trying to do a bunch of small files with small components because it allows you to kind of put the code that changes together close together. So for example, like we could move all of this and break all this out into kind of separate files and separate functions, but I don't necessarily mind, what are we at here? Like 422 lines. It's not too big to the point where it's like hard to navigate around. And most of the time, I'm like searching across my code base if I'm trying to find something specifically, whether it's, in NeoVim here or in VS Code or anywhere. So, yeah, I kind of prefer to keep larger files.
Okay, that works really. That should definitely work. So, like you mentioned, the actions, the exported actions are now like they're like RPC calls later in the front end code.
Exactly.
Yeah, awesome,
Yep.
yeah, awesome. That makes sense. Let's see. Did you use any of the newer form in the code?
I'm not using
Not yet.
form. Yeah, I'm not using form in this example, but
Okay.
this demo is using form. So if you go here and search for hat, this search bar uses form, and you probably noticed really quickly there was a loading state that we navigated to before we showed the results. Let's do it again. And to kind of show what this looks like, I'll just go in here, put this on 3G, and we'll search for a hat again. So we see we still get that fast transition, even though we have a little bit of a simulated network latency here.
Okay.
And that code's all open source
amazing.
as well.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, I think, yeah. Let me see if I have anything on my list. Yeah, I think is your code using the latest Turbo? Is there any noticeable?
Yeah. Both
Okay.
both this repo as well as this repo are all using Turbopack. So Next.dev -- Turbo, which definitely helps with performance. So worth trying for sure. Should be stable in Next.js 15.
Yeah, this is cool. I think I like it. I think we've definitely touched on especially the caching. Do you want to talk about it a little bit and show? Is it possible to show especially with this the newer caching thing that makes the cache control headers that make self-hosting a little bit easier in this code? Is it available?
Yeah, I don't. It's not in this example, but I do have this.
Okay.
This repo, which was kind of what I was talking about, this next self-host example, where I have a video, it's a tutorial, 45 minutes that you mentioned. There is an example in here of customizing the cache handler. If you want to see what that looks like, in terms of how that actually like materializes inside of the app. Actually, probably the page is a better look. It really doesn't look any different than the code you're used to seeing because you have either a revalidate on the fetch, which we're kind of slowly moving away from, or a revalidate at the route level. And this like framework code doesn't change at all. You still write it in this way. It's just under the hood, the way that you're controlling the caching to move from in memory to somewhere that's persisted is how you're using this cache handler, for example.
Yeah.
So it gets loaded in the config file right here.
Oh, got it. Yeah, awesome. I was just looking at the static route indicator. I was going to touch on it a little bit. based on what we've actually spoken about, like trying to simulate what you'd see in production and what you're seeing in development. I think this is a good step, right? Like the s- the static graph, you know which pages are static and which are dynamic by seeing an indicator. I feel something that's quality of life right there, right? Just makes things a little bit more predictable.
Totally. Yeah, it's our
Yeah.
first step towards larger kind of tooling that builds on features like that. Like it's a small thing, but I think it helps a
Yeah.
lot, and we want to slowly start to add more features in that realm. Another one that's nice is that the newest version of the React Dev tools now indicate server components in the tree when you're
Mm.
looking at them, and if you console log inside of a server component, it will also show up inside of the browser's logs, which is nice. So if
Yeah.
you're looking at the console.
Yeah, I think I love it because like a good tech for me is something that's predictable. Things break all the time. Hey, this is web dev, right? But if it's gonna break, I should be able to predict, okay, this is why it's broken, because so that I could be able to fix it. So seeing something like this is amazing. So the last question, right, which is also a user question, is what's next for Next? Because I think you've alluded to the point where you all are gearing up to make some more changes, especially with this async request API. It's like the
Yep.
foundation. So what are we looking forward to? Like maybe Q1 or maybe Q2
Mhm.
next year.
Yeah. So I would say the two next big things. One is getting Turbopack ready for builds. So we've got it stable for dev now, but we're going to do builds next. The second one is our kind of continuous journey of refining and simplifying the many different kind of conceptual things that you needed to understand in Next.js. There was like SSR, SSG, ISR, like all these 3-letter acronyms. It's like kind of a lot. And we're trying
Yeah.
to simplify that quite a bit to be basically like dynamic or cached. And if it's dynamic, you can, fetch data, display it on the page. It's fresh when you reload the page. You can mark your dynamic code using React Suspense, or
Mm.
your code is cached. And we're working on a more composable, configurable, and hopefully better developer experience for caching with the use cache directive. Earlier, you mentioned server functions, and we didn't really get a chance to swing back to that. But
Yeah.
you can kind of think of use cache, which is a Next.js directive, as kind of like a server function, which might sound kind of weird at first, but hear me out. It's almost like when you're calling into use cache, like you're calling a function, like you're calling a server action, because you need to understand what code is going to be evaluated so that Next.js can properly set up the cache keys for you. Basically, so Next.js knows what the inputs are, and it knows how to invalidate that cache for you. And
Yeah.
that's kind of how the Next.js caching system works under the hood, which is you mark your data fetching function or your component um, with use cache, and then you can kind of compose and put those pieces together. And Next.js is going to figure out the proper cache key for you. One, for better security, because it's very
Yeah.
easy to accidentally like miss a part of your cache key. And it also helps you then invalidate that cache a lot easier. It really makes the cache something you have to think a little bit less about in terms of the semantics of how it works. And instead, it's more about which parts of your app you want to have a cached result. So
Mm.
those are like the two big things we're working on next.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. This has been really, really amazing. I think we could wrap up here. This has been fun. I really love it. Is there anything you want to share that you didn't get to share, a plug or anything before we wrap up?
No, I don't think anything else. We're gonna keep working on this. If you want to read more about stuff I'm working on or my socials or anything, leerob.com is where all the stuff
Mhm.
is at. But thank you for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about this stuff, and you're doing good work here.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming, Lee. This has been amazing. Yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you.